Just when you thought we were done turning things off, it's on to the Services tab. We aren't proxying most of the protocols that WIngate is capable of handling, so we need to go down the Proxy Services list as well. Let's get started by double-clicking on FTP Proxy. In the Services Started drop-down list, we want to set the service to Disabled, then click OK to get back to the Proxy Services list. We're going to want the log file server enabled so we can view the WIngate logs in a web browser. Let's double-click that item to open that dialog so we can make a couple of changes to the defaults. We see that localhost 8010 should work in our browser address bar. We want to make sure the logs are only accessible from this computer. So like we did with the remote control service back on the Services tab, we need to make sure there is only one binding policy in place, and that it specifies the loopback adapter on 127.0.0.1. To do that, we need to select the binding category over on the left. In the binding policy area, there should be two lines, one indicating that the service will bind to any available adapter. We need to highlight that line and then click Delete. Be sure to leave the line that talks about binding to 127.0.0.1 because that's what enables us to view the WIngate log files on the local machine. After deleting the line that would have established a binding to any internal adapter, hit the Apply button below. You should see the results in the active binding area above update to reflect the change by leaving just our loopback adapter bound to the log file service. That done, let's hit OK and continue turning off unneeded proxy services. We handled a POP3 service earlier on the Services tab and disabled that service there. The entry here in the Proxy Services list involves passing POP3 requests through our machine onto a machine that is actually running a POP3 service. Let's double-click the entry here and disable the service since we aren't setting up a POP3 proxy service in this tutorial. Then we want OK again. The RTSP, or Real-Time Streaming Protocol Server, is for use by programs like Real Player and QuickTime. If we double-click that entry in the list to open the config dialog, we can disable this proxy service as well since it's not part of our current project. You may want to be noticing things for future use as we are turning some of these services off. You might notice, for example, that it shows port 554 as the one you need to forward through your router and allow through your firewall if you're interested in supporting this proxy at some point in the future. A quick Google search would give you the additional information that RTSP content uses the TCP protocol and the control information arrives on the same port that uses UDP protocol. That's the kind of information you would need when you do the router and firewall configuration part of supporting this kind of service. Again, I strongly recommend you start with just one proxy service like we're doing in this tutorial, then add any other services one by one, doing all the router, firewall, and testing stuff for each one of them, one service at a time. Alright, that's this service disabled. Time to click OK and move on. A SOX proxy is another example of something you might want to consider in the future, but let's double-click to open the dialog and disable it till we get our HTTP proxy working properly first. Once we've done that, let's hit OK to continue. We don't need the Telnet proxy service, so let's open that dialog up and set to disabled and then click OK. We don't need the Video Live proxy service, so let's get that dialog open. The help file says Video Live is an older standard for streaming video that has been more or less replaced by RTSP. We're not doing any streaming video at this point, so we want to disable the service and click OK to get back to the proxy services list. Let's skip the www proxy service for a minute and double-click on the XDMA entry to get that open. The help screen on this one talks about StreamWorks and Zing Technologies no longer supporting XDMA protocol. I could probably Google enough to figure out why anyone would want to use or run an XDMA proxy. That's pretty much a case of don't know, don't care on this one. Let's just disable and hit OK and finally get back to a proxy service we actually want to enable. Alright, time to get our www proxy set up. Double-click to open the dialog. On the General tab, we see the default service port for incoming traffic is 80. We've already decided on port 8080, or whatever you picked back when you did the router forwarding step, for our service, so we need to change that. We also need to get into the bindings category on the left and get that set to the adapter we assigned the static IP to. The contents of the binding policy window is going to vary depending on which adapters you have enabled on your machine at the moment. In my case here, I've turned off all but one local area connection adapter, so there are really only 2 lines in the binding policy box. The loopback, or local host binding on 127.0.0.1, is handy for testing, and we definitely want to leave that one in there. The problem with the default setting is the line that says it will bind to any and every internal adapter it sees. The first thing we want to do is delete that binding policy line and replace it with one that specifically identifies the adapter we want the service to receive traffic on. We do that by highlighting the line and clicking delete. With that binding policy removed, we need to hit the Add button to get the new one added in. In the binding policy selection window, we need to open the section associated with the local area connection that we chose back when we decided which one to set up way back before we installed WIngate. You remember back then we made a special point of remembering the make and model of the adapter. This is an example of where we want to use that information to make sure we're working with the right one selected. If we click the little plus sign to the left of the adapter name, we should see the static IP address we assigned to our adapter, and clicking on that line will fill in the little box showing that it's selected. Once our static IP is selected, we just click OK. You should see the second line in the bindings area now say bind only to our static IP on our chosen adapter. If you click the Apply button, you see we've got a nice specific binding to our chosen static IP on our chosen port in the active bindings window. That was the input part. Now we need to specify exactly what happens with the output. To do that, we select the gateway section on the left. The first thing we want to do is set the connection scheme drop down to Use Specified Connections in Priority Order. That change will give us access to an Add button in the area below. When we click Add, we get the choice of adapters for the outbound direction. In the case here, since we disabled all but one local area connection adapter, there's only one choice. If we did have more than one adapter enabled, we would be looking for the one we want to use for outbound traffic. When we click all the little plus signs to the left of our selected adapter in the headings below, we see our gateway IP under the Gateways heading and the static IP we assigned to our adapter under the Source IP address heading. If we highlight our gateway and adapter IP address, it will fill in the little boxes that show they are selected, then clicking OK will lock in our outbound configuration settings. There's one other thing we want to set, and that's under the Policies category over on the left. We want to identify the users that can access our proxy. The default rights initially apply to this service, but to be more specific, we want to click the Add button. If we click Add, we see the options to add everyone, including unknown users, is already selected. The other options under the Location and Time tabs specify that things are wide open as well. That sounds like what we want to do, so click OK. We see in the rights area now we have a line that says everyone has unrestricted rights to our proxy service. There's a few other options associated with the HTTP proxy service. The defaults there all work fine for our purposes. And we want OK to put us back to the main Gatekeeper window again. We don't have a lot of use for the Users tab for our public proxy. You may want to consider setting up user accounts with usernames and passwords and arranging them in groups, and then specifying in the Policies section of any active services exactly who is or isn't allowed. But that's more than we're going to cover here. There's actually just one more configuration task we need to do. It's on the Network tab over on the lower right of the Gatekeeper screen. If you drag the window borders and column dividers of the Gatekeeper window around to get a better look at the Network Connections section, you'll see that there are a lot of adapter entries listed. You notice the adapter we have been working on is the one right at, or at least very near, the top of the list. There's a horizontal slider at the bottom of that Network Connections area, and if you drag it over to the right, you'll see our static IP and default gateway associated. This is the line we want to double-click so we can tell WIngate about this adapter. To do that, we need to scroll back to the beginning of the line where we see the adapter title and click right on Local Area Connection. The way the dialog appears when it comes up, it looks like WIngate has incorrectly auto-detected the adapter as being connected to an internal network. We want to make sure that the adapter is correctly identified as being connected to an external untrusted network. That means simply set the radio button appropriately and click OK. There are a few more things up in the main menu to look at. Let's choose File, Save Changes, and close Gatekeeper and give the system a quick reboot to make sure we've got a working proxy.